Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am the Reverend Dr. David D. Grafton, Professor of Islamic Studies and Christian Muslim Relations, and Director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center here at Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. So we'd like to welcome you to this teach-in on Iran, Shi'ism, and warfare in the Middle East, which is sponsored by the Duncan Black Macdonald Center. Just a few words about the center before we begin. The Duncan Black Macdonald Center for the Study of Islam and Christian Muslim Relations is the country's oldest center for such a study, which began in 1973. The Macdonald Center is a research center within HIU dedicated to scholarly research, education, publication, and communication in the areas of the study of Islam and Christian Muslim relations. It provides resources to engage in critical learning, dialogue, and share perspectives on a range of issues related to Islam. Now, this particular teach-in is intended to provide some background and a variety of religious perspectives about the ongoing war in Iran and the Middle East. Now, while we have all watched many pundits discuss and debate the military strategies, political and economic aspects of the violence, we want to raise some of the religious issues, those religious identities that provide substance and sustenance for many different adherents, Jews, Christians, Muslims, and those of other religious traditions, as well as the variety of complicated interests that are intertwined with religious beliefs in this messy violence. We want to bring these voices together today. Ultimately, here at HIU, we are, and we believe that we are creatures of the same Creator, human beings together. And we are all interested in moving forward toward peace and justice. And of course, we want to hear from you. This will be an opportunity for you to ask your questions in the Q&A throughout this webinar. So, in this webinar, we'll first hear a bird's eye view from Iran, and then we will hear about Iranian international relations in the 20th and 21st centuries and missed opportunities for peace. And then we'll hear the important various perspectives held by American Muslims, Jews, and Christians about the war. And finally, we hope to provide some religious resources that hold out a positive role for religion. To do this, I'm joined by my colleagues at HIU. Dr. Deena Grant, Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of Jewish Studies. Dr. Hossein Kamali, Professor of Islamic Studies and Interreligious Studies and holder of the Imam Ali Chair in Shia Studies and Dialogue among Islamic Schools of Thought. Dr. Khan Shairani, Research Scholar and Affiliate Faculty Member. Chaplain Aida Mansoor, Director of Field Education. And Dr. Lucinda Mosher, Professor of Interreligious Studies and Director of the MA in Interreligious Studies. I'm very thankful that they've all agreed to participate in this teach-in. As this is a webinar format, there's no chat option. Please put your questions in the Q&A box to be found at the bottom of your Zoom bar. And after all of our panelists have presented, we will take questions from the floor. But please do put your questions in the Q&A as they come up to you throughout the webinar. We anticipate the webinar will go for an hour and a half. We'll see how long we go. But I'm glad you're all here with us today for this important teach-in. And to get things started, I would like to now call on my colleague, Professor Hossein Kamali.
Thank you. In the name of God, we begin. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and actually greetings to you in any time zone from which you may be joining us for this teaching today. Let me thank my colleague, the Reverend Dr. David G. Grafton, Director of the Duncan Black Macdonald Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, for the initiative to hold this teaching, for suggesting this. And then I want to thank the administration at the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace to make this teaching on perspectives on Iran, Shi'ism, and warfare in the Middle East possible. This is a university named for peace, and of course, it behooves us to say something and to add our voice in defending peace. This makes it necessary for me to thank specifically President Sherry Turner, the president of this university, who takes this ethos particularly seriously. It is my privilege to begin our discussion today about this ongoing calamity of warfare in the Middle East. Today, I promise I'll be brief. I've been given 15 to 20 minutes. I will try to keep it as short as I possibly can. Today, 11 days pass since the governments of the United States and Israel have launched a massive military campaign against Iran. And as a result of that, violence has escalated rapidly and reached alarming levels throughout the Middle East. Of course, it is my wish and my hope that war should stop immediately and that people are not killed anymore anyway. This is particularly important because this is the holy month of Ramadan, which is especially important as a time of spiritual development and care. Also, today marks the 20th day of the month of Ramadan, which in the Shia tradition, the tradition I represent, has a particular significance. And I remember as a child, before reaching the age of having to fast, even before that, I would try to fast the 3 days, the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st, or at least one day from that 3-day period, because that marked the martyrdom of Imam Ali in the month of Ramadan. This is also the nights of destiny that are particularly times of prayer and pious spiritual exercises for Muslims. Let me begin by showing a map that shows what I want to talk about, that kind of opens up the scene. This is a map of the Middle East, a general term, a military term, originally from the time of the First World War, and then especially after the Second World War, it became in use specifically to refer to countries to the east of Egypt, including Egypt. So you can see that on this map, and on the right side of the Middle East, on the right end, on the eastern end of the Middle East, you would find Iran. Usually the countries of Afghanistan and Pakistan are not included in the Middle East, but then this is a disputed category. Middle of what? The relationship between Middle East, Near East, Far East, and then North Africa. Is the North Africa also part of the Middle East or not? For the purposes of this discussion, we will talk about the countries from Egypt to Iran. And let me say a word about the etymology of the word Iran. Iran is a very old name, going back to Avestan sources from the first millennium BC, the land of the Iranians, the people of Iran, is attested as a very early word going back to the 6th century BC. More specifically, as of the 3rd century CE, there is ample documentation for the word Iran. And what it designates, usually the geographic coverage of Iran has been much larger than what Iran is today. So, but for today's discussion, we will only talk about the present day Iran. Let me the present geography of Iran. And of course, there is an intimate link and connection between geography, knowledge, and power or politics. So let me begin by talking about some illustrative geographical information about the Middle East. Let us look at the next slide, where you can see the approximate population and the approximate area of Middle Eastern countries in 1,000 square miles in terms for the area and in terms of million people for the population. So Egypt is the most populous country with more than 110 million people, and Iran comes next with more than 90 million people. Then comes Saudi Arabia as a distant third with 37 million people. And then, of course, at the bottom of the list, we have the country of Bahrain. We have the country of Bahrain with only 1.5 million people. Just for the record, I should add perhaps that Bahrain used to be part of Iran until the 1970s when it acquired its independence. In terms of geographic coverage, the largest country in the Middle East is Saudi Arabia with 839,000 square miles. Most of that land, almost 90% of it, is not habitable, is uninhabitable. It's desert land, but still it's a big country. It's a huge country. And then comes Iran with 637,000 square miles. Again, you see Iran is a big part, a significant part of the Middle East. It's old, it's populous, it's large. By the way, I have a comment that says my voice is breaking. Is that the case? If not, can we see the next slide, please? Or the next, and the next? Okay. Let me say something about geography. You may have noticed that I did not include the country of Turkey, a very important country in the region. But again, whether Turkey or Turkey belongs in the Middle East or not, again, that's a contested issue. I didn't include it on the map. I didn't include it in my discussion. However, Turkey is also a very important country in the region, whether we want to use the term Middle East or West Asia, and then include Afghanistan as well as Turkey, undisputedly. Now, I want to mention another important aspect of Iran and understanding Iran, and that is energy. The important issue of oil reserves. The total proven oil reserves worldwide roughly amounts to 1.8 trillion barrels. One oil barrel is equal to 42 US gallons. So you see what we are talking about, the volume that we are talking about. The country that has the largest proven reserves globally is the country of Venezuela, that has been in the news lately, with proven reserves of up to 300 billion barrels. That is 17% of the global share. Then comes Saudi Arabia, then comes Iran, Iraq, then comes Iraq, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. You can see the numbers. Again, Iran is an important country here. I will not spend too much time on the numbers, but you have them. So the second takeaway here, the first one being that Iran is a populous, large country in the region, in the Middle East. The takeaway here is that the Middle East remains the largest geographic concentration of petroleum resources in the world, and Iran has the second largest petroleum reserves in the Middle East, the third in the world. Let us now turn to another source of energy, and that is the world natural gas reserves. The next slide, please. The largest reserves in trillion cubic meters belongs to the country of Russia. Then comes Iran, then comes Qatar, then comes the United States, and you have the numbers. And I have summarized this in the next chart, pie chart, that is on the next slide, the approximate share of global fossil fuel reserves. Globally speaking, Iran holds 15% of global fossil reserves, fuel reserves of the world, 15%. That's a large number. Now, related to this, let me talk about the economy of Iran. What is the share of Iran of the economic wealth of the world? And that is on the next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, let's go back to the one, two slides back. 2 slides, yes. So in terms of gross domestic product per capita in $1,000, the country of Switzerland is the third rich country in the world in terms of GDP per capita, with $110,000 per year per capita. The United States is number 6 with 90,000. Then number 8 is the country of Qatar in the Middle East, with a per capita income of $85,000 a year. Then comes Israel, 60,000, followed by Germany and the United Kingdom, not in the Middle East, around 60,000. And then we come to the United Arab Emirates with a GDP per capita of 51,000. I'm not sure if the audience here would know the per capita GDP of Iran. The rank of Iran is only 110, despite its resources, and the GDP per capita is around $5,000. Qatar, 85,000, Iran, $5,000. One could ask why. Next slide, please. There are excellent studies on the relationship between oil and politics in the Middle East. I have chosen 6 books to introduce to you here by Tim Mitchell, by Robert Vitalis, and others. There's not much time for me to get into it, but if there is any interest during the Q&A, I would gladly describe this. One reason, of course, is mismanagement, that the share of Iran, the prosperity of the nation from oil income and energy income, fossil fuels, is so low is because of governmental mismanagement. But there is also the very important element, decisive element of economic sanctions of Iran. And I have addressed this on the next slide, that especially since 1995, these unilateral embargoes and energy sanctions have been in effect on Iran, and they have been particularly tightened ever more after 2020s to the present. So let's look at the next slide. I want to talk a little bit about war. In fact, sanctions are part of the war. They are an integral part of the war. They are an element in economic warfare, which is a big issue. Despite all sanctions and limitations, foreign as well as domestic, the Iranian people have thrived. Let me cite only one example of the level of education of women in Iran. Women constitute about 60% of graduates in natural sciences in Iran. A similar number in humanities, and women have historically made up to 70% of students in STEM fields, in science and technology and medicine fields. This is amazing. This just shows the power of the people. Let us have the next slide, please. Oh, next, please. Okay, forget about, okay, I didn't have these. Let's keep it here. Let me just say a word about the recent uprising in Iran in 3 years ago, 3.5 years ago, known as the Women Life and Freedom. That was an expression of the public will for improvement. That was definitely not the same as war. It did not call for war on the Iranian people. No, it was a demand for freedom and further progress of the people. I'll turn to just some general statistics about religion in Iran. After all, the title of this teaching has to do with Shi'ism. And I would like to say that the great majority of Iranian population are Shia Muslims. Approximately 95% of the more than 90 million people in Iran, that is more than 85 million people, are Shias. Very clearly, Iran is the heart of the Shia world. That is a significant part of the Muslim population of more than, again, statistics, like geography, is a very contested field, but the numbers are cautiously above 400 million people. And Iran, with its 90 plus million people, is the heart of Shia Islam. It is looked up to as such. Approximately 5% of the population are Sunni Muslims, approximately 5%, that is around 5 million. And these would be mostly some of the Kurds in the northwest, the Baluchis in the southeast, the Turkmen, very small population in the northeast, and some parts of the Arab population, some of whom are Shias, some are Sunnis in the southwest. Most important point, again, here is that this sectarian difference between Sunni and Shia Islam is not that central, and it need not be brought in as an element of divisiveness. The Sunnis in Iran, I should add, that most of them follow the Hanafi school of law, if anyone is interested and curious about this. There are also protected religious minorities in Iran, Christians, around 400,000, mostly Armenian and Assyrians. There are 20 to 25,000 Jews. This is the largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside Israel. Around 40,000 Zoroastrians, mainly in Yazd, Kerman, and Tehran. And there are also unprotected or marginalized religious minorities. Perhaps the most numerous and populous are the Baha'is. Statistics vary on the number, but sometimes as many as 300,000 people are mentioned. There are others as well. There are particularly a group known as the Mandaeans that live in Khuzestan, very small minority, very interesting, late antique community, the community that traces its heritage back to late antiquity, with around 10,000 people. There are also others. We may talk about this later. Iran has a very rich historical heritage. I will end my presentation shortly just by showing a few examples. This is the site known as Hegmatane in northwestern Iran, dating back to the Median period, 7th and 6th centuries BC. Next slide, please. Not far from this site, there is the tomb of Esther and Mordechai, the two characters you may know from Jewish history, from biblical history, in also northwest Iran, not far from there. I'm showing you an image of the inside and outside. This is another image. Next, please. Next, please. This is the one before. This is the Beastun inscription, very old inscription from the 6th to 5th centuries, from the time of King Darius or Dariush on the mountain. Next, please. we have this depiction of King Shapur I, going back, representing one of the early figures in Sasanian history, the time of glory of the Iranian kingdom and kingship from the 3rd to the 7th century. Next, please. And rather than showing all these images century after century, I will show you 3 examples of the height of Shia revival in Iran during the Safavid period. The Safavid dynasty that ruled Iran from the 16th to the 18th century had strong rivalries with the Ottomans. This is one moment in which this Shia Sunni distinction became politically significant as well as doctrinally significant. And these are 3 examples of Safavid architecture that are preserved as and recognized as UNESCO heritage sites worldwide. Next, please. One of the buildings also in that area is the one I'm showing you here. It is the Ali Qapu building from the 17th century, built by Shah Abbas. And next image, please. This building was attacked yesterday, and parts of it were destroyed. I don't have an image of that, but I'm showing an image of another cultural site that was also hit yesterday. And this shows the Takht Tawus, the peacock throne that reportedly had been carried from India to Iran during the 18th century. And now, as you may see, you can see the devastation here. Next slide, please. All of these aside is the human cost of war. On the first day of the war, a school was hit. More than 100, according to some estimates, more than 180 or 168 people, most of them children, were killed. And I think the most telling image is that of a grieving mother holding a picture of her daughter, of her school age, primary school age daughter. Next slide, please. Every day I have a chance to speak with a friend of mine, with an old friend of mine in Iran, a family friend, very close friend, who calls me and tells me about what is going on in Iran. There is no internet connection. She calls me from a landline. And she tells me about her 93-year-old mother, who insists on fasting. Her mother is from Isfahan, family is from Isfahan. But she also tells me that they are all distraught. And as she told me this morning, they live life breath by breath, one breath at a time. And the last image I show is the image of the Azadi Square, the Freedom Tower, that was designed by a Baha'i architect, Hossein Amanat, whom I had the privilege of meeting last year. It was built in the 1970s. It too has been under attack. And if anything, it shows that war does not bring freedom. War destroys freedom. Thank you very much. And I turn to my colleague, Dr. Khan Shairani, to continue.
Thank you very much, Hossein. I'm really grateful for the kind of human element that Hossein is kind of pointing out. I will be speaking a lot more about the historical relationship between the US and Iran, as well as some more geopolitical matters. But I want to head this off by saying there are many Iranians who live in the United States. Many are refugees from the Iranian Revolution, as well as many students who study in the US, many who I know. And so the first thing I wanted to highlight is that both Iran and the US are incredibly diverse, religiously, ethnically, politically, and we tend to think about that relationship in purely geopolitical terms, and that is where a lot of that conflict stems from. But I also want to show today that the US and Iran have been entangled in our historical relationship for a long time, and that there have been moments of collaboration as well as distrust, and for good reason. And so US and Iran have undergone significant shifts due to regional geopolitics from the early 20th century. And so I want to highlight some major flashpoints in that relationship, and we'll get a sense of the historical background that animates the conversations we might see on the news. And as a historian, I think it's valuable to frame this conversation starting with the European colonial period, which is the so-called Great Game between the Russian Empire and the British Empire in Central Asia in the 19th century, where two empires fought in Central Asia for global domination, and Iran was at the center of that. This fight would, of course, shift to a communism versus anti-communism fight in the post-World War era as well. And so we'll go through some of that. But I want to start in 1906, when a constitutional revolution replaced the old dynastic rule with a constitutional monarchy. In 1908, oil was discovered in Iran by British prospectors, and from then on, the constitutional monarchy suffered several challenges as Russian and British forces helped to overturn the constitutional government against the wishes of the population, but the people kept rallying and reinforcing the constitutional structure. And by 1911, that was the structure of the state. But in 1921, there was a army officer by the name of Reza Khan, who, with the help of British resources and weaponry, overthrew the Qajars and started a new dynasty, the Pahlavi dynasty, and he took the name Reza Shah. This is the Pahlavi dynasty that is when we talk about the Shah. Now, the structure of the constitutional parliamentary government remained from 1906, but Reza Shah installed his prime minister, who administered the state under his directive, as kind of an authoritarian ruler, and he took the state in a modernizing direction. As we spoke earlier about Turkey briefly, in the same time period, Turkey is also modernizing in similar ways. Now, the Iranian state's transformation was centered on oil revenue, and it was shared with a British company, the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which would later become British Petroleum, BP. And this is important for later sort of political dynamics in the 60s and 70s. Now, this pattern of Russian and British involvement continues into the Second World War, when in 1941, Reza Shah is also exiled by Russian troops. But by British request, his son becomes ruler, Mohammad Reza Shah, instead of a Qajar prince from the last dynasty, which had ended early in the 20th century. Now, the Shah this is who we call the Shah. He is a modernizer like his father, but he's just 21 when he is selected by the British to rule. And this initial coup, instigated by the Russians, is to facilitate their war efforts against the Germans, as Iran becomes a supply route for the Allies during World War II. Now, this leaves Mohammad Reza Shah on a throne largely buttressed with oil money, and he is a weak figure. And so the beginning of the Shah's regime is thus beholden to British oil interests in the region, and that remains essential to the story of Iran up until today. And the way that his father was exiled with a sudden military takeover by Russian and British troops, and the weakness of the Iranian troops in that overthrow, made him especially obsessed with modernizing his military and maintaining strict control. And that was largely done with major military purchases from the US throughout his reign, using oil revenue. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is in the coup in 1953. And so in 1953, there is a coup against the prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, who had tried to exert more transparency by auditing the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And the oil company refused, and so the Iranian parliament nationalized the oil industry. This worried the British government, who convinced the US Eisenhower administration to help using the CIA to initiate and plan a coup against Mossadegh. This coup included CIA-paid pro-Shah demonstrators and rioters, propaganda, bribes to figures in the Iranian bureaucracy and military. This, of course, strengthened the Shah, creating a pro-Western, anti-communist ally in Iran, and it preserved British oil interests in the country. And this eventually led to massive military investments by the Shah with US-made military weapons, and also with CIA training of the Shah's secret police, the Savak, which were implicated in torture of dissidents in Iran throughout the Shah's reign. Now, this turned the Shah from a figurehead into an authoritarian ruler. And so I'll quote somebody, former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said about the coup, she said this in 2000, quote, "The Eisenhower administration believed its actions were justified for strategic reasons, but the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development. And it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their internal affairs." The Eisenhower administration also, at the same time, helped Iran start a nuclear program with continued US help in developing the program until the end of the Shah's reign in 1979. The next period I want to talk about is the lead up to the Iranian Revolution in 1978, with this coup in the background. And now the revolution was largely unexpected, with US President Jimmy Carter saying in 1977 directly to the Shah during a state visit to Iran, quote, "Iran, because of the great leadership of the Shah, is an island of stability in one of the more troubled areas of the world." He said to the Shah, "This is a great tribute to you, Your Majesty, and to your leadership, and to the respect and the admiration and love which your people give to you." Now, this state visit by Jimmy Carter was followed by a year of protest against the Shah, with protesters going out into the streets in larger and larger numbers. These protest movements were famously headed by Ayatollah Khomeini, but also there are other dissident kind of figures who were part of this movement, and it was a very diverse movement. But Khomeini had been in exile since 1963, initially in Najaf, Iraq, just across the border, and then on request of the Shah in 1978 was exiled and went to France. And he was heavily covered by Western media outlets as a kind of celebrity while he was there. And as this quite diverse protest movement, which included lots of women as well as students, workers, and religious scholars against the Shah, grew, the Shah eventually appointed Shapur Bakhtiar as prime minister, and he went into exile in Egypt, where he was close friends with Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, who himself would be assassinated a year later. The Shah died a year afterwards in Egypt from cancer after getting treatment in the US, and Khomeini demanded that the Shah be extradited to Iran, which the Carter administration refused, which set up a confrontation between the US and this new government. Ayatollah Khomeini returned to Tehran in early 1979 and immediately began consolidating power, removing the last prime minister and appointing a parallel government that eventually took over the entirety of the country. Unfortunately, in November of 1979, the Iran hostage crisis started in response to the US refusal to extradite the Shah. This is perhaps the single biggest event that dictates how Americans have thought about Iran for the rest of the century, as students, Iranian students who supported Khomeini took hostages at the US embassy. At the same time, the revolution prompted the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979. So this had regional effects. The hostages remained in Tehran for more than a year, being released soon after the inauguration of Ronald Reagan, as Jimmy Carter's administration lost support in the US with a failed attempt at rescuing the hostages, gas shortages, high inflation, high prices, weak US economy, a lot of problems. Now, while the hostage crisis was ongoing, Iraq invaded Iran in September of 1980. So there's multiple wars that are happening in the region at the same time. And this war would last nearly as long as the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, under the helm of somebody we're familiar with, Saddam Hussein, the secularist president. Saddam Hussein saw the Iranians as weak, and he was buttressed with US weapons and military aid. So he saw this as an opportunity to take back land that the Shah had wrested from Iraq in the 70s. The US then supplied Iran with weapons through Israel under Ronald Reagan, which came to be known as the Iran-Contra affair. This meant that the US was in the position of secretly supplying weapons to both sides of the conflict. Iran's position between Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and Afghanistan meant that the US, worried since the 1950s about communist factions taking over the world, had made Iran a strong ally with the Shah, but by the 1990s, a new reality was taking shape in the region with the rise of Saudi Arabia as a major oil state as well, and as Hossein was showing, with the rise of sanctions against Iran. Now, you can go to the next slide. That's the entire 20th century in a nutshell. And so with the 21st century, we see some possibilities and some challenges, which is, I think, the theme of my presentation. Starting with the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian government played an important role in helping the U.S. gain allies on the ground, particularly the Northern Alliance, which the U.S. allied with to fight the Taliban in Afghanistan. But soon after, the U.S. invaded Iraq as well, and the Iranians worried about the U.S. funding of what they saw as anti-Iran dissident groups, which had existed since the 1950s, such as the MEK, while the Iranians also started funding groups in the post-war collapse that also saw the rise of ISIS in the region due to that instability. Now, the major issue that is discussed in relation to Iran goes back to the U.S. establishment of a nuclear program in Iran in the 50s, and then as it was supported in the 60s and 70s by different U.S. administrations. The Shah himself developed the nuclear program, eventually drawing on European support when the U.S. no longer wanted to support his nuclear ambitions. Since the Iranian Revolution, the Khomeini government initially didn't care that much about nuclear capabilities. They were not interested in nuclear power, but since the 1990s have become more and more interested, as well as becoming a staunch opponent of Israel in the region, and allying themselves against people that the U.S. is not allied with. Now, Barack Obama said in a speech, in his Cairo speech in 2009, he said, quote, "For many years, Iran has defined itself in part by its opposition to my country, and there is indeed a tumultuous history between us. In the middle of the Cold War, the United States played a role in the overthrow of a democratically elected Iranian government. Since the Islamic Revolution, Iran has played a role in acts of hostage-taking and violence against U.S. troops and civilians. This history is well known. Rather than remain trapped in the past, I have made it clear to Iran's leaders and people that my country is prepared to move forward." Now, this was followed just 6 years later by the Iran nuclear deal, which is also called the Joint, I always forget the whole name. It's like some comprehensive plan of action, I believe. Which included the UN Security Council, US, UK, China, Russia, and France, as well as Germany and the European Union. And it agreed to constrain Iran's nuclear capabilities and only using nuclear power for domestic energy production. Now, this was broadly accepted by the international community, except for Saudi Arabia and Israel, until the US withdrew from it in 2018 under President Trump. Since then, Iran also withdrew from it last year, especially after a surprise Israeli attack on Iran last June, which the US then joined and targeted nuclear facilities and nuclear scientists, politicians, and military leaders in Iran, killing about 1,000 people. Iran retaliated and killed about 30 people in Israel, as well as some US troops, I believe. And so the conflict today is seen as a continuation of that conflict from last year, with more surprise attacks on Iran, killing the leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, as well as much of his family, as well as targeting other Iranian officials, specifically with the goal of regime change. Now, it is worth noting that this is very much against international law. Assassination of foreign heads of states is very much illegal. I think I'll just conclude quickly here. Iran has been important imperial power since the 19th century, largely a strategic land to maintain control of the region. With the discovery of oil, it has also become important to the global economic order. This oil revenue has been a sticking point for external governments like the British and post-World War II, the American government. The Russian Empire has remained an important regional player, even as it transitioned to the Soviet Union and then back to the Republic of Russia in the 1990s. The modernization of Iran under the Shah was largely done through this oil revenue, and this resource has been important leverage for the state that has been under severe economic sanctions for decades, which has devastated the Iranian economy and made it even more dependent on oil. Now, these sanctions were partially lifted in 2015. This multilateral deal with the UN Security Council and the European Union, intending to keep Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Now, most recently, since 2018, when the US withdrew from the deal under Trump, the US is no longer working with other partners on diplomatically resolving these conflicts. the Trump administration has largely decided to work unilaterally to effect regime change, partnering with Israel and largely centering the conversation around the fear of Iran developing nuclear weapons. So these three threads of oil, nuclear power, and maintaining the regional status quo are largely what animate these decisions on the geopolitical level for the US. Although this is very much a low point, I think, in US-Iran relations. And I wanted to show over the course of this that there's always hope. There have been moments, missed chances, and one can only hope that we move in a different direction. I'm going to hand it off with that really whirlwind, quick trip over a century of history to Chaplain Aida Mansoor. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shairani. Assalamu alaikum. May God's peace be with you all. In this holy month of Ramadan, we are supposed to be focused on our relationship with God, on our relationship with our Creator. But for many, this has been somewhat of a challenge. The coverage of the war and the killings is incessant. And the media's focus and bias, Fox News, CNN, etc., the way they frame what is happening has many Muslims frustrated and angry. The aim of the media seems to be to control and push a particular narrative and force spin rather than simply report on what is happening. There is a deep concern and anxiety, a scary uncertainty as this war escalates and little is done to keep the warring parties in check. This past week, I was at the public hearing at the Connecticut Legislative Office building, concerned with a bill promoting the need to address Islamophobia in schools, and several young people testified. They shared their stories of being bullied, of being harassed in school for just being Muslim. Now, we know that at any time there is a war in the Middle East or Muslims feature in the news, bullying incidents rise dramatically in American public schools. There is a systemic rise in anti-Muslim racism and bigotry. Studies show that Muslim students continue to have the highest rates of being bullied on a daily basis. And due to this, we are seeing more children with anxiety and depression in our community. Now, as a mother and as a member of the American Muslim community here in Connecticut, I feel frustrated. I feel angry. And I feel an immense pain and sadness that so many innocent people, among them so many innocent children, are being killed in our name, and that there is a lack of feeling and compassion for those innocent men, women, and children who have lost their lives. We need to remember the human cost. We need to remember, as Dr. Kamali mentioned, we need to remember those innocents in the line of fire and the fear and anguish they must be going through. We need to remember those innocent men, women, and children who are forced to leave their homes, who face drones and bombs on a daily basis. We need to remember them on these sacred days of Ramadan. And of course, we need to pray for peace. We pray for the innocent in this war. Grant them peace, unity with their families, and safety in their homes. May they have justice and live in contentment and peace. Allahumma anta salam wa minka salam wa tabarakta ya dhal jalali wal ikram. O God, you are peace, the giver of peace. From you is the source of all peace. Blessed are you, O possessor of majesty and honor. Ameen. Amen. And I'd like now to pass it over to our Dean. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to offer two very different perspectives in the Jewish community about the US and Israel's recent attack on Iran. But before I do so, I'd like to give a bit of history to demonstrate how difficult it is to detach the Jewish perspectives on the war with Iran with the Jewish connection to Israel. As a Hebrew Bible scholar, I like to go back to the Bible. And Iran, Persia in the Bible, plays a big part in ensuring the survival of the Jewish people. To elaborate, in the 6th century, the Babylonians attacked Judah destroyed the temple, and exiled the Jewish people from the land of Israel, sending them to cities around what is now modern-day Iraq. After 70 years of exile, King Cyrus of Persia ascends to power, reverses the exile, and allows the Jews to return to their land. He even helps them rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And you can see citations from Cyrus's own words in the cylinder in the slide, as well as the Jewish response as per the Bible, cited in the Bible, which was that Cyrus of Persia is a savior of the Jewish people sent by God. He is even referred to, actually the only individual referred to as Messiah, Mashiach, the anointed. So in point of fact, by helping the Jews return to Israel after the exile, Persia enables the survival of this people. And it also marks a turning point where Jewish history splits into that of Israeli Jews and diaspora Jews. Now, skipping ahead to the modern period, the 20th century. Another reason it is difficult to separate Jewish perspectives on Iran from the Jewish connection to Israel is because the relationship between Iran and Israel has impacted the lives of Iranian Jews and beyond. This is well-worn territory, but in short, under the Pahlavi dynasty, Muhammad Reza Shah opened up diplomatic relations with Israel. Things were good, relatively good. There was an Israeli embassy in Tehran. There were even direct flights and tourism between the two countries. Relatedly, Iranian Jews had more civil rights, were moving out of the ghettos and becoming more a part of the fabric of everyday society. The Shah may have viewed Israel as a strategic partner in his aim to develop and modernize the country, and he may have viewed Iranian Jews as a bridge between Iran and Israel. Many Jews at the time wanted to be seen not just as Jews, but as Iranian Jews. And they were especially encouraged by the fact that under the Shah, Iran was the only neighboring Muslim country that did not join in war against Israel immediately after Israel was declared a state. All this changed dramatically under the Islamic Republic of Iran, for whom Israel is the enemy and under whom Iranian Jews are endangered. Khomeini, back in the past, cut off all diplomatic relations, called U.S. Satan, Israel Satan's bastard child, declared Israel an illegitimate Zionist entity, a cancerous growth, and a plague, and supported Hezbollah and Hamas terrorist assaults on Israel. There is a well-known, interesting case under Khomeini, most recent, in which the state executed an Iranian Jewish businessman, but the charges against him were all about Israel. He was executed because of his friendship with the enemies of God, an enemy of the friends of God, for exploiting the resources of Iran to help Israel, who incessantly combats, steals, and affronts Islam and God. And other things related. The day after his execution, a small group of Iranian Jews visited Ayatollah Khomeini and said, are we safe? Can we stay here? His answer was, we separate the affairs of our own indigenous Jewish community from those blood-sucking Zionists in Israel. We will fight them to the death and not you. If this was intended as comfort, it did not comfort. Especially because he had this line painted on walls over every Jewish school and synagogue. And as an aside, for some Jews, modern statements such as, I am not anti-Semitic, I am anti-Zionist, can be reminiscent of this thinking and can be quite triggering and fear-inducing. In any case, seeing the writing on the wall, literally, tens of thousands of Iranian Jews fled. So it is against this background that I'd like to provide two diametrically opposing perspectives among Jews on the war in Iran, one critical of the war and one supportive of it. And I'll start with the critical of the war. As an example is cited in our slide. Some of the reasoning is as follows. It is strategically misguided. It risks regional catastrophe, does not win the freedom of the people oppressed under this regime, and may even strengthen the hard-line clerics, which we might have seen in the past day or so. It is immoral, dangerous, morally problematic. It creates civilian suffering and death and threatens the lives of tens of millions of people as it expands. And finally, it is against Jewish values. Jewish ethics emphasizes peace and restraint, especially the biblical prophets who preach justice and the protection of civilians and protections of all civilians and the weak and the vulnerable. And with Jewish ethics, we see even post-Bible in discussing wars of a choice versus defensive wars, rabbinic literature emphasizes war as a last resort after diplomacy fails. Moving to the perspectives of those who support the war. The reasoning is as follows. The current regime, and here is some examples of this reasoning. The current regime threatens the future of the Jewish state and the larger Middle East, and in fact, the world. The Islamic Republic has been clear about its intent to wipe out Israel, repeatedly calling for its destruction. Khomeini promises that Israel will undoubtedly be uprooted and destroyed. He called Zionists a plague that manipulates Western governments and promises that Israel will not see the next 25 years. Khomeini, linking Israel and the Jews more directly, has stated that from the beginning, Jews have been bitter enemies of Islam who work against Islam to spread corruption and establish Jewish domination throughout the world. So for Israelis and for some Jews, when countries say they want to destroy us, they say we take it very seriously and will do anything to prevent it. The second reasoning that I've seen is current terror attacks. The Iranian regime wants an end to Israel, and to achieve this, from this perspective, they directly support proxy groups like Hezbollah from Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen, who have been sending unrelenting missile and drone attacks at civilian targets in Israel for decades. The regime also supported the unprecedented cross-border assault on October 7. So Israel must defend against these coordinated missile assaults and terror attacks, which also threaten peace and stability across the Middle East. The hope, misguided or not, is that with regime change, the flow of funds to these groups will stop, Hezbollah and Hamas will become less powerful, and there will be less terror attacks in Israel. So, as you see, there is definitely not a single Jewish perspective on this war. However, something that Jews, I believe, have coalesced around is a fear that what's going on now will increase anti-Semitic attacks both in and outside of Israel, as well as the hope that whether or not a particular Jewish person supports the war, that they not be blamed for it. May this war end soon, and may all human beings learn to treat one another with peace. I now bring it over to Dr. Grafton, I believe.
Thank you, Dean Grant, for that presentation. So I will now be speaking about current general American Christian responses to the war. And in my estimation, there are three broad categories of these responses. First, those that are in favor of the war for particular religious reasons. Second, those who have condemned the war for moral or religious reasons. And third, those who have not explicitly condemned the war, but lament and warn of the consequences of war, as we've heard previously, the human cost. So first, those in favor of the war for religious reasons. The Military Religious Freedom Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to ensuring that all members of the United States Armed Forces fully receive their constitutional guarantees of religious freedom, says it has received more than 200 complaints from service members across all branches of the armed forces that some of their commanders had, quote, urged us to tell our troops that this was all part of God's divine plan, end quote. One serviceman claimed that his superior said that, quote, President Trump has been anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran to cause Armageddon. Now, we can't verify these statements, but several members of Congress have asked the Department of Defense to investigate. Nevertheless, some of these comments are in line with what we have seen from other parts of the administration. 2 weeks ago, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth invited Pastor Doug Wilson to preach at the Pentagon. Wilson is an advocate of Christian nationalism and frames contemporary geopolitical issues through a literal reading of the Bible from a Christian perspective. U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, an ordained Southern Baptist pastor, has supported the state of Israel and the U.S.'s right to attack Iran based on his literal interpretation of the Bible, known as an overarching hermeneutic called Christian Zionism, that interprets the Old and New Testaments in a particular way based on Christian commitments. Now, outside of the administration and among evangelical church traditions, there is strong support where the current conflict in the Middle East is often interpreted through a literal Christian prophetic understanding of various books of the Bible. For example, Pastor Greg Locke of Nashville posted on social media, quote, the modern-day Haman, from the book of Esther, threatening to eradicate the Jews, has been eliminated, referring to Ali Khamenei, just a couple days before the Feast of Purim begins. Here we are prophetically living in the book of Esther, end quote. Lance Wallnau, an evangelical pastor from Dallas, noted a prophecy that Iran would fall in the 47th year. He interestingly highlighted that the Quran says that the Messiah, El-Masih, will return. Now, he understands the El-Masih in the Quran to be the Antichrist. So in an interesting way, he uses the Quran to prove a literal reading of the return of Christ in the book of Revelation. John Hagee, another Christian Zionist pastor from one of the largest megachurches in the U.S., has preached about the Project Epic Fury. Quote, the Bible warned us in the last days, nations would align themselves against Israel. Persia, modern-day Iran, is named specifically in biblical prophecy. This is not random, end quote. Now, among American Iranian Christians, Hormuz Shariat, a Tehran-born, now based Texas founder of Iran Alive Ministries, said that many Christians in Iran who had been planning to emigrate or to get out are now cautiously optimistic, he says. Many hope that a brighter future may be dawning after the attacks. Now, for those who are against the war for moral or religious reasons, Michael Gorman, a New Testament scholar at St. Mary's Seminary and University, the oldest Catholic seminary in America, stated, if violence and war is the way to peace, then ancient Rome was right and Christ died for nothing, end quote. Two Christian organizations immediately issued statements condemning the war on February 28th. The Society of Friends, or the Quakers, said this, we know that war is never the path to peace. We mourn the deaths of all victims, and we hold their loved ones and communities in the light. This war is immoral and illegal under both U.S. and international law, end quote. The Churches for Middle East Peace, which is a conglomeration of 34 different Christian organizations, said, we condemn in the strongest terms the military strikes carried out on Iran by the U.S. and Israel. And the executive director of the Churches for Middle East Peace, May Elise Cannon, said this, we reject the U.S. administration's framing of an American exceptionalism that casts the United States and Israel as inherently good, while portraying Iran and other Middle Eastern people as inherently evil. Now, those Christians or Christian organizations that have not condemned the war, but have lamented and warned of its consequences. There are many denominations that have not come right out and support or condemned epic fury, but have indicated their distress and have warned the administration and other Americans about the devastations of war. They, some of the denominations, quote, mourn the rush to war and the moral cost. One statement notes that the prosecution of this war does not represent the promotion of a just order, but rather its failure. Now, the United Methodist bishops, who often make social statements, only stated that they, quote, urge leaders on every side to turn from the escalation of violence and seek paths toward justice, reconciliation, and lasting peace. Cardinal Blaise Capich, excuse the pronunciation, the Archbishop of Chicago for the Roman Catholic Church, issued a call to conscience. He wrote, "A real war with real death and real suffering being treated like it's a video game is sickening. This horrifying portrayal demonstrates that we now live in an era when the distance between the battlefield and the living room has been drastically reduced. The moral crisis we are facing is not just a matter of war itself, but how we, the observers, view violence, for war now has become a spectator sport or strategy game," end quote. Some Christian traditions that have strong ties to Christians of Iran or the Middle East have tried to be vocal about how these events will more than likely affect the indigenous Christians of the region. This has been particularly true of several Baptist denominations and the Lutheran Church in America. Finally, there are a few statements specifically mourning those innocents killed previously by the Iranian regime. This has been done by the Episcopal Church and the Friends Committee on National Legislation, a branch of the Society of Friends, or the Quaker, who have said this: "We have and will continue to condemn the violent actions of the Iranian government towards its own people, which have resulted in the deaths of thousands of Iranian civilians. But more war is not the answer." American Christians are not of one mind on this issue, and in many ways, their Christian views reflect the political divide that we see in the polls. And there are many studies that can demonstrate how this breaks down by political party. If you can go to the final slide, please. Finally, there are a number of books that I would like to lift up for our viewers that might be helpful in understanding both the American Christian interaction with Iran and Islam, and that address the issue of anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism, and a helpful study on Iranian Christians in the diaspora, those that have left Iran. These books, I think, provide Americans with some very good tools to think about, as Dean Grant said earlier, and as Aida Mansoor said, the rise of anti-Muslim bigotry and the rise of anti-Semitism that often follows these geopolitical contexts. So I would now like to turn this over to my colleague, Professor Lucinda Mosher.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all of you who have come to this webinar. We do appreciate your presence. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in the sight of God, my strength and my Redeemer. I have an inkling of what it is to be a resident of Tehran at the moment. I was a resident of Manhattan in 2001. The September 11th attack was horrific. I can still conjure the smells, the sounds, the heaviness. Against the ensuing violent retaliation, I was a vehement protester. Not in my name, I said, certainly not in the name of the Prince of Peace. 2 months and a day after the trade towers were destroyed, Iran's President Mohammad Khatami was visiting New York to participate in a meeting at the UN, if I recall correctly. He wanted to see the famous Cathedral of St. John the Divine while he was in the city. It fell to me to make that visit happen and to serve as docent for his entourage. I treasure the memory of that afternoon. I am indeed grateful for the many opportunities I have had as a scholar activist to work with Iranians, some Zoroastrian, most Muslim. Last October, when the Macdonald Center joined with scholars from the University of Tehran in offering a webinar on roots of peace, it was my honor to provide a Christian perspective. I'm sharing with you some of what I said. I noted that the Bible mentions peace hundreds of times, both as a greeting and as the name of a desirable, readily available state of affairs, the source of which is God. In Paul's letter and in early Christian theological discourse, peace is a communal norm alongside love and brotherhood, gentleness and self-control. The Gospel of John records a moment in which Jesus, anticipating his arrest, says to his disciples, "My peace I give to you." Jesus' gift is given as a remedy for fear. In the Christian rite of Holy Communion comes a moment when the celebrant declares, "The peace of the Lord be always with you." The people reply, "And also with you," and then say to each other, "The peace of the Lord," as they exchange hugs and handshakes. Why interrupt the solemnity in that way? Fear can be addictive. Peace is therefore a gift of much value, but that value can be accessed only by reciprocal giving. The ritual passing of God's peace from one worshiper to another is affirmation of God's presence, expression of a communal wish for harmony, embodiment of preference for flourishing. Early in his ministry, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus had said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." But how is peace to be made? Among strategies advocated by many Christians in the religion's formative centuries and since are nonviolence, love of one's enemy, and transformation of weapons into tools for other purposes. 3 New Testament authors reiterate the mandate found in Psalm 34. Depart from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. How is seeking different from pursuing? Seeking involves tapping into hope, curiosity, mindfulness. Pursuit is more active, more intentional, more deliberate, more persistent, more arduous. The Bible's implication that peace must be both sought and pursued suggests that peace must be waged. Waging peace requires preparation, fortitude, and proper equipment, a point made in the Epistle to the Ephesians. One 2nd century Christian leader, perhaps having in mind the prophet Isaiah's call to beat swords into plowshares, taught that using a sword is incompatible with being Christian. I wonder what he would say about Christian use of today's munitions. According to Jesus, the greatest commandment is to love both God and neighbor as ourselves. As I see it, this is a command to be with others as God is with us through Jesus. In the branch of Christianity I espouse, the congregation is called upon periodically to reaffirm answers to a series of questions associated with baptism. Among them, will you strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being? The all and the every make this a very tall order. Yet we always promise that we will, with God's help. How to proceed? In the present situation, it is crucial that such striving be intentional, deliberate, persistent. All people, those with whom I disagree, included, deserve justice and peace. The dignity of every person, whatever each one's role is in the present situation, is deserving of respect. And so I draw upon the centuries-old great litany and pray. From words and deeds that encourage discord, prejudice, and hatred, from everything that prevents the human family from fulfilling your promise of peace, O Lord, deliver us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mosher, for that final prayer. We implore peace. We have a few minutes for questions to come from participants who are attending. So please, I encourage you to do that. There is one that I would like to raise for all of us, but I think primarily for both Khan and Hossein. And the question has to do with what will happen to relations in the Gulf, and what will things be like moving forward in the Gulf. I'd simply like to add, at least from my perspective, that these particular challenges now, the geopolitical challenges in the Gulf, are primarily political and economic, as opposed to what Professor Kamali said earlier about a Sunni Shia split. I don't think we see that in this case. But I would like to hear from both Hossein and Khan about their views about what they think will happen moving forward with relationships in the Gulf.
Hossein, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Grafton. About the avoidance of the Sunni Shia split, I can only support that view that the very idea of a split is a highly political and toxic division. So people who during the early 2000s coined terms such as the Shia Crescent, they have been very much agents of war, agents of carnage in the region. If anything, we need to emphasize unity among the people, and more than anything, emphasize the human dimension. You know, Iran has been the land for hundreds of years where most of what we know as Sunni Islam was developed. From Ash'ari theology to Hanafi law to Shafi'i law to Iran in the broad sense, including Afghanistan, which is a very important part of that world. The Hanbali tradition was developed more than anywhere else in Isfahan. So there is a classical period that is up to the coming of the Mongols in the 14th century, 13th century. And then there is the post-classical developments of the 14th century onwards. Before the post-classical period, most of the developments in Islam, what we know as Sunni Islam, took place within the Iranian world. So that's extremely important not to fall for the trap of a Shia-Sunni discord. Especially, it's important for American Muslims to avoid that, to shun that, and to without the agents of division in the Muslim community. And there are many, unfortunately. The future of the Persian Gulf is extremely fraught. Please let me know if I talk beyond my time limit. We are faced with the possibility of withdrawal of investments from the United States, the promises or the braggings about stock market having attained certain levels is gone. Oil prices are up, even though with manipulation they may come down a little bit, but the threat is very real. The threat is very real on the Persian Gulf region, on the Strait of Hormuz, and on alternative routes for carrying petroleum and gas, that is through the Red Sea. So this is an important juncture in which alliances are going to be redefined explicitly. So the United Arab Emirates has to come out and take an explicit position. And this is not in the future, this is just happening right now. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman has played an important role in brokering peace so far. So even though I don't have a crystal ball to predict the future, but I can see that this is a decisive moment for the future of the Middle East and the future of the Persian Gulf, because the Persian Gulf is a new frontier. If the Middle East was a concept that was important for the Cold War, it was a military concept, but it became a political concept. Then the lands from Egypt to Iran. Now, more and more, we have the emergence of two alternatives. One is West Asia, that includes Anatolia, Turkey, not only Anatolia, but Turkey, larger Turkey, including its European part. Includes Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a big player. 25 years after the war in Afghanistan, we spent trillions of dollars. The US government spent trillions of dollars to go back. So what is going on to happen in this new frontier, the Persian Gulf? So my answer, even though I avoid going into details, and I'm not a political analyst, is that we are standing at a turning point for the relations between Arab countries, Iran. Iran is the largest single political entity there. And despite efforts to disintegrate it, I don't think it's going to happen. And I hope it's not going to.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to hear from Khan. I just want to point out, though, your comment about maps. It was after 2003 that Afghanistan began showing up on maps of the Middle East as part of the Middle East, as opposed to part of Central Asia. And that was a result of U.S. invasion. So maps change, right? Khan, I'd like to hear from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'll go on what you just said, David, about maps. I frame these kind of conversations from almost an 18th century perspective about, the Great Game, 19th century. And I think about things in terms of Central Asia a lot because of my own academic training. But also, I'm a peace studies scholar, and there were some quotes you mentioned from, the Quakers and such that I think speak to me because I just don't think that war is ever a solution to whatever the conflict might be. And so the relationships in the Gulf may change, but at the end of the day, people will still need to come together to figure out what they're going to do moving forward. And that has to do with dialogue. It has to do with compromise, figuring out a way to move forward and live together. And this is why I personally think that this seems like a grave misstep because it doesn't really seem to align with anyone's interests, regardless of who you are in the region. And that's coming from a peace studies perspective. I think that there needs to be a willingness to enter into dialogue, regardless of how you feel about others in the region. And then secondly, I wanted to say that I talked a lot about the post-World War II order, that communism and anti-communism, and that kind of conversation is kind of over. And I see a lot of people now thinking in terms of a post-US global order as well, because the US seems to be pulling back from its commitment in post-1945 in terms of, well, we are going to make sure that, there is some kind of stability in the world, and taking actions unilaterally is kind of how that's happening. And I'm wondering if I think that even political analysts who are really well, versed with these things are in a state of, they don't know what's going to happen next either, because this is completely unprecedented. And if we're thinking just in terms of global geopolitics.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and there's a really important one, and that is if we could explain or describe the diversity of reactions or opinions from Iranians, both in Iran and in the diaspora, about what is going on. We've seen pictures and images of protests, and we've seen images in favor of the strikes by Iranians in diaspora. So could, not necessarily the two of you, but does anyone want to speak to their views of the diversity of Iranian responses? Anyone?
I mean, I can speak a little bit more on this, because I work with students who are Iranian, both Jewish and Muslim students, and there is a significant portion of part of the Iranian diaspora who left Iran in 1979, and they're living in the United States, but also their children have grown up with a kind of a sense that the overthrow of the Shah's regime was unfair, and that is the portion in the United States that feels maybe aligned with Reza Pahlavi, who is the son of the Shah. And there are certainly plenty of people within Iran who might not be monarchists like that, but they're also worried about the Iranian government's tactics versus its own people. And then there are plenty of people who are worried about U.S. interventionism and illegal attacks on other people's countries, right? Like there are plenty of different kind of diverse reactions for that, for geopolitical reasons, and there are histories behind each of those different groups. Just as a preliminary answer to that question.
Yeah, Lucinda, it looks like you. Thank you for that, Lucinda. It looks like you wanted to say something.
I think I would respond. I have not been tracking the responses over the past few days, but my response to the question would always be a reminder that no category of people is a monolith, and that there are numerous fault lines that would divide one Iranian from another here or in Europe or any place else, and in Iran itself. So those are age, experience with socioeconomic experiences. The fault line list is rather long, and just keep that in mind, that it's never just one thing, and no group of people is uniform in that way.
Yeah, Hossein, do you want to say anything?
If possible, Dr. Grafton, I would like to highlight Pastor Daniel Schlorf's question, who has asked, how might you, any panelist, suggest interreligious professionals provide spiritual care to Persians, Iranians, or even the U.S. citizen who feel powerless to stop a war? I think this is a very important question, very much in keeping with our mission and with our ethos. And if it is possible for interreligious pastors, priests, religious leaders of all stripes and kinds and categories to reach out and to talk about the essence of religion, which has to do with justice and peace. If there is no peace, there is no justice. If there is no justice, there is no peace. If you can reach out to Iranians, Iranian-Americans, Americans, anybody, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or any background, it really is a human issue. War is inhuman. War is for profiteers. War is evil. Let's call it that. Let's provide pastoral care for people who suffer, wherever they are, of any religion, of any nationality, any background. Instead of highlighting, okay, this political group stands here, this other political, and these are the grievances. Maybe after peace is established, we leave that to political analysts. Political analysts are just that. We have a bigger and higher calling, I think, as an institution and as specialists in this field. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think about the trauma of war, and
Yes.
our peace building students all, study the effects of trauma and how communal trauma, especially, and how that is complicated and confusing. And so, Lucinda, as you mentioned earlier, being in New York on at the attacks in 9/11, and the fear and then the anger and the worry, it's confusing. So I've seen a number of interviews with Iranians, both in the country and in the diaspora, where, now they're confused. Like, how do you respond, even if you're in favor of regime change? How do you respond to your homeland being attacked by outsiders? I mean, it's got to be very confusing. So
I think the literature of lament is a powerful place to turn at this time, no matter who you are. That it's an answer to the question, what do I do with my anger, whatever it is that's about the present situation that's sparking that anger. And I also think it's very important to remember the religious complexity of Iran right now. It is a multi-religious place, and people are turning in lots of different directions for solace, for a moment of calm in the midst of horror.
yeah, especially as Aida Mansoor said earlier, during these days of the end of Ramadan, right? Important days here. Well, thank you. I'd like to bring in Susan Schoenberger, our Director of Communications, for a few final words. Thank you for being here, Susan, and hanging out in the background.
Sure. Thank you, David. I really want to thank all of our speakers for their expertise and their time. It was really a wonderful program, and I can see that we had a lot of questions we weren't able to get to. So if this is something, you might be interested in sort of a part two, please, let us know. I'm just going to condense what I was planning to say just because we're running out of time, but really, I think the most important thing to say is that, especially if you are new to us, if you would like to learn more about programs like this, which we do often, and they're often free, I'm going to put something in the chat which would allow you to sign up for our newsletter mailing list. And this is just a weekly newsletter that you would get on Fridays and would help you keep track of all of our course offerings and our events and everything else that we do. And of course, you can also follow us on social media and keep track of what we do through our website, hartfordinternational.edu. So we hope you come back again for another program like this one. We are really your trusted resource for understanding the multicultural and multi-religious world that we live in today. So thank you again to everyone for speaking and sharing your worlds with us, and thank you to everyone who participated and attended the event. Thank you.